Good morning to most, good afternoon to others, and good evening to those across the pond. I'm Jason Miles, your host for another episode of This is Revolution Podcast. If you're new to the channel, please like, subscribe, and if you're enjoying what you see, make sure to hit the notifications bell as we're constantly adding new episodes. Recently, Ben Burgess of Give Them an Argument came down to hang out with me here in Baja, and we recorded one of our first episode of Terrace Talks. Ben aired the video version on his channel. If you want to check that out, you can hear the audio version on our TIR Spotify, Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, wherever you get your podcasts. You can hear it there. It was a good time. We discussed some of the writing he was doing while he was down here, and of course, the insane movies we were watching. Also, this past Wednesday, we said goodbye to Forrest and the movie night extravaganza crew. Thank you, Forrest and friends, for some interesting leftist movie talk. If you haven't checked it out, you should subscribe to the movie night extravaganza YouTube channel. They have a current episode up where they discuss Heathers, the 80s teen film noir with the director. I believe his name is Michael Lerner. Still don't know how they pulled that one off. And also, we're going to be adding even more new shows that I can't really get into right this minute. I'm excited about that. Also, I do have to mention the new merchandise that we have. Who doesn't want to own Pascal Robert's smiling face on a t-shirt? And also with the website, we've added the ability to watch the show. Me inside of me. This is revolutionpodcast.com. You can get all your TIR stuffs. There's also links to the audio-only podcast as well. All that being said, let me bring in the TIR crew, Saturday crew. First and foremost, he is my homie. He is my dog. He is the Avery Brooks to my Spencer. He is the Pascal Robert.
Peace and ingredients in the chat. Peace and ingredients in the audience. Peace and ingredients, Jason Miles. I'm telling you, you're coming up with them, boy.
Well, when Gene Baudelaire said you look like Avery Brooks, and also our guest who was on, we were having a conversation earlier, and our guest resembles very strongly Edward Norton. So the picture looked like Edward Norton and Avery Brooks, and all I could think was Spencer for hire. Gene was thinking Star Trek. I'm thinking Spencer for hire. Hawk. There you go. Dr. Claus said Hawk.
There you go. Hawk. That was a cool show.
They remade it with Mark Wahlberg. Not as cool.
Nothing will be as cool with Mark Wahlberg.
And let's bring in the lone female representation, the headless voice of reason, Pascal's Haitian partner in crime, M. Toussaint.
Hello. It's true. I was looking through my communion pictures and I saw Pascal in the background.
Oh, wow. M. Toussaint swears that somehow I was like playing dominoes with her uncle at some kind of family function, and she has pictures of me there, either a communion or some kind of Catholic service or something like that.
How do you guys say domino in Haitian patois? What do you guys say when you domino?
We don't play bones in American style. We play the Caribbean style where you're not playing for points. You're just playing to run the board.
Okay.
So
there's something that you have to say.
Domino. It's a domino.
But there's a way you say it. You don't say it like that. You got to say it with the domino. Yeah.
Sounds good. That was good.
That was very good. Yeah, but M. Toussaint she's like, I know I used to see you waiting for the Q4 going to
For real. Queens Village.
I'm like, we were living in different towns, and I'm a lot a few years older than you are, so I don't know how much that's possible.
Use hops.
Did you know
And
Pascal when he had a ducktail and Lee jeans?
yes, that was when he used to be a van driver. I'm joking.
I
Um,
was
you were just a passenger. Room for three. Room for three. Leaving soon. You got to explain the dollar van one day.
Yes, you have to explain all. We have to have a part 2 of Pascal growing up in New York. That was actually one of the
Yeah.
better Mau Mau episodes. Or actually, it wasn't even a Mau Mau episode. I think that was just an
It was
episode.
a special that you put together, and I was like, "Why are we doing this?" You were like, "Trust me, trust me." I was like, "All right, fine." It actually surprisingly went well.
Sometimes I may know what I'm talking about.
I'll send you my pictures to include next time.
I can hear someone talking in the background. Whose house is that loud?
For once, it's not mine.
Is it Pascal's house? Is the loud house?
That was
Pascal's house.
mine.
Can you take the camera outside and show us all the convention that's going on outside your door?
Show us the chicken you put in the sink. Because you took it out the freezer on time today.
You always say that. And you know what really makes me mad every time you say that is that I always forget to take the chicken out.
You know what? It's really adult stuff. You learn.
Mm-hmm.
You pay for that when you don't take it out.
You really do. And it's like, well, not today. Not today.
Yep.
But also I want to remind people of the other big news is that we have a live show October 23rd, Teragram Ballroom, TIR, Give Them an Argument, and of course, Left Reckoning, a left media powerhouse of a presentation. Tickets are on sale now. Wherever you're watching or listening to this show, there should be descriptions there should be a link in the description. And there should be a link in the chat. There are still some VIP tickets left. With the VIP, you'll get to hang for a bit before the show, get an autographed copy of one of Ben's books, and we're adding more stuff to the package constantly. I actually had a real good talk with Ben and Dave about a real cool thing we're adding. I don't want to mention it yet because I'll probably fuck it up and jinx it if I mention it now. So I will not mention it, but I want to see you guys there. Derek Varn, Daniel Bessner, Anna Kasparian, Nando Vila. Who else? More names are going to be added. There was even more names on the conversation about who was going to be there. So I am very, 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 very excited for the first live show. The other thing was a launch party that we did in conjunction with Sublation Media, and that actually was hella fun. Cuba is also going to be at the live show in LA. We are discussing if we are going to have matching Adidas sweatsuits. So that's going to be fun.
Be surprised how many people love the crack.
Maybe that'll happen. So I did want to, before we bring our guest in, I did want to talk with you guys about something I've been reading about. Are you still there, Toussaint?
Yeah.
Oh, you're just so quiet. Why are you so quiet?
I was modding. I was putting links in the chat. I was consorting with the folks and the people. I know.
You just don't want to be the on-screen talent anymore, huh?
No, I'm just still a woman of the people, and I am beholden.
Woman of the people.
There you go.
Well, real quick before we begin our conversation with our guest, Alex Hochuli, I just wanted to bring to your attention 2 articles I saw that hopefully will add some much needed context to discussions around public education, its failures and its successes. There have been several massive teacher strikes over the last few years. And one of the reoccurring themes in major metropolitan areas with these teacher strikes in areas like Oakland and Los Angeles has been the issue of affordable housing. It's not just a portion of the student body who sadly have unstable living conditions, but the educators as well. What kind of learning environment does this situation create? In a recent story from KQED, the Bay Area public broadcasting station, the school district of Milpitas, California, is asking residents to rent rooms to teachers, not even homes, just rooms to teachers. According to the article, roughly 4 in 5 California counties are seeing their median home prices rise over the last year. There's data released in August. In the last year, Milpitas Unified School District lost 10 teachers, officials said. 7 moved to more affordable communities, and 3 left California. Teachers and schools should be considered pillars of our community, yet we allow them to operate in some of the most precarious conditions. Suppose teachers are living not just hand to mouth, but also dealing with mega commutes and housing insecurity. We already know the classrooms are underfunded to the point where many teachers are using GoFundMe style apps to get supplies needed to teach our kids. Just recently on this show, and with the help of the TIR audience, we were able to raise money for a classroom at Perry's Elementary School in Richmond, California, where I grew up, because the teacher could not even afford to get the basic materials for her class. How do you guys feel about all this?
Let me tell you something, man. Public education in America is a point of political contention in a way that I don't think I would have ever expected in my young adult life. With the rise of the charter school and the private school privatization movement, the fangs are out for the attempt to gut the even precarious existence of public schools from our society in ways that I wouldn't expect. After COVID, that just took the problem and just blew it up even worse. And what kind of society can you have when all of the mechanisms of that society give an aura of anti-public education?
In a front page above the fold article in the LA Times, 72% of all students across all grade levels are underperforming in math and 58% in reading. The article puts much of the blame on this for the pandemic. And I think we can all agree that, first of all, we're not really out of the woods as people are still dying from COVID, but also we haven't seen the end results of the economic effect of COVID. But circling back to the original article, how can we have adequate public education in cities like Milpitas when the average cost of a home is over $1 million? Toussaint, do you have anything to add?
I don't even know what we are asking of these teachers anymore. It's not even fair. Telling people, who are they telling to rent these teachers' rooms? Just regular people?
The citizens. 55 from the article. 55 citizens had signed on to rent rooms. To give you guys an idea, of home size and price in a place like Milpitas. While the average home is $1 million, you're also looking at homes that are also extremely small. These are not gigantic mansions or whatever you would think $1 million house would be. Right. A lot of these are 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom houses under 2,000 square feet. There's some new construction that's a little larger, but ultimately Milpitas has been a bedroom community for some time, but now it's kind of on the edge of Silicon Valley. So.
Well, I think the Hamptons in New York has been a bedroom community too. It's a regular community. It's just that rich people summer there. Mm-hmm. So some of the regular people can't afford to work there anymore. And people who would commute in can't afford to work there anymore. I don't know. It's appalling. It's like, yeah, rent teachers bunk beds and give them a drawer to sleep in. Just like,
someone had said in the chat, that's nice of you to not acknowledge that teachers have families as well. Right. I mean, the school district that I went to high school in, Albany, California, which was, it's kind of almost an anomaly when we talk about the school district. There were people that lived in the district that no longer had kids at the high school or the junior high, but they still worked. And when I say worked, this wasn't the job they needed to pay the bills. This was kind of like, oh, my mom is still the librarian. My mom still volunteers at the office because she likes being part of the PTA in the school. So even areas like that are changing, sadly.
Yeah.
And it affects education as well. So.
I read recently that a lot of children are being held behind for another grade. They're repeating a grade. Mm-hmm. Everyone is. I mean, the fallout of COVID, we're still experiencing it, especially since people are pretending it doesn't exist anymore. But there are definitely problems that existed before, as Pascal said, that are being exacerbated.
Well, I think that's going to lead into the larger conversation that we're going to have today with our guests. After the fall of the Soviet Union, political theorist Francis Fukuyama pronounced that this was the, quote, end of history. Capitalism had proven victorious. And as the Mandalorians say, yes, no way. Neoliberal capitalism failed in 2008, and the ongoing COVID crisis has exposed the failure of government and institutions. Are we now becoming hyper-politicized as a result? Does our hyper-politicization oppose neoliberalism effectively? Were protests viewed as spectacles that have deprived us of a deeper understanding of how to organize real movement? Can we rage tweet our way to viral accountability for political malfeasance? From our guest essay in Sublation Magazine, in a world in which determinate interests are delegitimated, politics becomes wild and unmoored. There is a material explanation for this. Politics has returned, but without its traditional engine. No longer is politics practiced by and for masses of people bound together in large organizations pursuing a common purpose. Politics is pursued through pop-up protests. Movements coalesce around a hashtag rather than their headquarters. In real life or on the internet, indignation is directed at everyone and no one. The world at large is presumed audience. Our guest, Alex Hochuli, is an independent writer, political analyst, and translator based in Sao Paulo, Brazil. He is co-host of Global Politics podcast, BungaCast, and co-author of a book I rather enjoy. And he actually was on last year talking about this book, The End of the End of History. His writings on Brazilian and global politics has appeared in Jacobin, American Affairs, Damage, and others. Please welcome, coming all the way live from a bunker in Brazil, Ed Norton. But not just Ed Norton, American History X Ed Norton.
Exactly. I'm delighted to be back on. I'm a recidivist now, right? I'm a repeat offender. So that's one item ticked off the bucket list. So I'm very happy to be back.
Now you're in Brazil and it is winter there.
Doesn't feel much like it today. Doesn't feel much like it, but it is winter, yeah. The very end.
Is school out right now, or is school still in session for the kids?
I don't have kids, and I have no idea.
Good answer.
Like, I just see little bastards running around all the time.
No. School's in at the moment.
Does Brazil, where you're at, suffer some of the same issues that we see in the States, or is this kind of unique to the U.S.?
In reference to education, you mean specifically? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I was actually just looking at some figures the other day. Brazilian teachers are some of the worst paid, I guess, relative to median income, for example, in the world. And even if you compare it to, like, whatever, take Argentina. Okay, Argentina is a bit richer, but Colombia, for example, Brazilian teachers are paid worse. The starting salary is often somewhere like 2 times the minimum wage, the monthly minimum wage, which is often how things are referred to in Brazil, like relative to the minimum wage, right? Are you earning 2-3 times, whatever? So yeah, teachers are very poorly paid. Brazilian education is very bad, and all these global rankings, for what they're worth, Brazil scores very poorly. There's little emphasis placed on education, and that all comes from an elite which historically, doesn't read books, for example, right? Hasn't really aspired to even the kind of things that aspired to in kind of early capitalism, of trying to emulate the aristocracy and try to be smart and educated and well-rounded and whatever. That's not been the case for the Brazilian elite, and that's kind of filtered down into the way societies run.
Oh wow! Did you want to add something, Pascal?
Well, Brazil does have a very rigorous intellectual left tradition in the country.
Yeah, it does, but it kind of ends up kind of standing out from that. I think that's a good point, actually. I mean, it's something that's maybe underscored too often. intellectually, the left has always been very kind of well read. I often find discussing with Brazilian Marxists compared to maybe British ones, I'm always like, wow, you guys really know your shit. It's intimidating. So yeah, no, it's that definitely is the case.
Yeah, but one of the things I also noticed is that, which to your larger point is about Brazil and education, is that a lot of these kind of oligarchies in the Caribbean and Latin America and South America, there's an emphasis put on supporting private education to the detriment of public education. It's almost like public education is almost not even valued at all, but there's a very big emphasis on particularly private Catholic education that comes along from colonial history that stays as a kind of a residue that still exists within many of these societies.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's even like it even causes certain disgruntlement amongst the middle class. Certainly more squeezed aspects of the middle class, who are like, "Wow, we can't afford private education anymore. It's becoming too difficult." Which obviously, because it's the middle class, it never leads into support for improving public education. But that's also a result of the way the labor market's structured, where you just don't need educated workers. Indeed, many workers are kind of completely in the informal economy. So they really, in terms of from the perspective of capitalists.
That's a frightening vision of the future, but that'll lead me into my first question. just to kind of rehash your book, The End of History, is a take on Fukuyama's, was it 1992?
96.
Was it 96 he wrote that?
Well, the essay in Foreign Affairs came out in 89, and then it was turned into a book, which came out in 91 or 92. Yeah.
I thought it was 96.
Yeah, the End of History. What is, just briefly, what is Cliff Notes version of Fukuyama's End of History thesis?
I mean, he basically felt that with the falling apart of the Soviet Union and the really existing socialist regimes around the world, that this model, which was supposed to be held as not just an alternative to capitalism, but something better than capitalism, the next stage of history, as that had failed, capitalism was the only game left in town, and that it helped effectively to be the, as he called it, the final form of human government, right? That liberal capitalism, and that's not specifically kind of the US model of capitalism, not necessarily what you might have in Denmark. It's not, but broadly speaking, liberal capitalism in the kind of widest sense of the term was the only game in town. It had proven itself to outlast its rivals. And as a consequence, the world would slowly become liberal capitalist. The whole world would become liberal democracies. That doesn't mean that there wouldn't be exceptions to that. There'd be some kind of holdouts, like whatever, North Korea, for example. But those holdouts didn't represent an alternative for the rest of the world, much less a better vision of the future, a better way of organizing human society. And in this world in which there was only liberal capitalism, things would be actually a little bit glum. So while people in the U.S. State Department, for example, were celebrating when the Soviet Union fell, Fukuyama, even though kind of associated with a certain kind of neoconservative strain, noted that there should be a bit of a glum time because the tension had gone out of the room, so to speak, right? If capitalism had to sustain itself, especially throughout the whole Cold War, and legitimize itself by its opposition to the Soviet Union, which it could point to as being authoritarian, no individual liberties, none of the consumer goodies that American capitalism provided. And without that enemy, it would be a little bit at sea, and which is what we saw, right? You had the war on drugs, you have the war on terror, now you have the war on domestic terror or white nationalists or whatever they're trying to do in the US. But it's all a kind of grasping around to try to find some enemy to legitimize the system, because it doesn't really have very much to say for itself. It doesn't really have much promise. And obviously this isn't part of Fukuyama's argument from the end of the 80s and early 90s, but as you have very low growth capitalism now throughout most of the world, reality is that you can't even buy off people with growth, right? You can't have rising wages. You can't redistribute a little bit of the profit because it's become a much more zero-sum game.
Do you think that demonstrates the belief in the end of history that Fukuyama puts forth in his book that became such a prevalent, almost kind of unipolar worldview about the dominance of liberal capitalist hegemony in terms of the globe? Would you agree that it's the 2008 crash that basically delegitimizes that worldview, or does it begin earlier than that, perhaps with the war on terror? What do you think is the actual linchpin that delegitimizes this end of history narrative that became so salient?
I mean, it's interesting that there's obviously recurring end of history talk of end of history or the end of ideology specifically in the 1950s, right? Have the great clashes between communism and eventually fascism in the intra-war World War, and then in the early 50s you have people like Daniel Bell going, "Well, this is a bit. It's all over now. All that exciting stuff is over. This is the end of ideology." So you do have it's kind of a recurring trope, if that's not putting it too kind of flippantly. In the early 90s, it is much more end of history, and that's related to not just the end of the Soviet Union, but the historic defeat of working class movements and the workers' movement as a whole across the West, and really in some ways across the world. Although there's always variation. So you might have people coming up and going, "Well, what about in Sri Lanka they had the Tamil Tigers, or in blah blah blah," and yes, there are always exceptions, but they prove the rule. And when did it start coming apart? When did that complacency about the end of history start coming apart? It's not entirely clear. There were some people I remember Fareed Zakaria, kind of U.S. neoconservative, said that the end of history was over in relation to 9/11. I don't think that was the case, in part because of what comes after, right? Because what comes after wars of choice, right? It is complete imperial hubris on the part of the United States, thinking that they can shape the world kind of lazily, like kind of laid back on the sofa, right? Just kind of playing video games, commanding drones and so on, without committing mass ground troops, for example, to completely reshape Iraq, which would have been necessary if they were to really carry out a sort of imperial reconfiguration of Iraq. It was just literally like, let's point guns at it, shoot a bit, and then see what happens. Democracy will emerge, right? And so that hubris is, I think, is a reflection of like the formation of an elite within the US and across NATO countries that had no longer had to think pretty hard, right? It no longer had to kind of confront difficult choices because it had it all too easy. They had kind of the world at their fingertips. So they just kind of went, yeah, let's click some buttons and see what happens. And so I don't think that was the end of history, right? I don't think that was the moment. I think, as you suggested, Pascal, it's the global financial crisis, which is a real shock, right? It's a real shock because it completely counteracts the discourse that we had all been sold, that the kind of financial class had been selling itself as the kind of boom and bust. Even the business cycle was now over, that things they were running on autopilot. You'd have continual growth. And so that was important. But, as we argue in the book, and I think as I mentioned last time I was on, it takes a little while for the political consequences of the 2008 crisis to really break out, right? So, I remember when the 2008 crisis happened, I was like, whoa, shit, okay, I've got to go back and read political economy, because I had not really thought about economy, because it was just one of those things that's in the background. It's just this background hum about which you can't really do anything. You can complain about distributional questions, or you might say like, oh, you should raise taxes a little bit. But the idea that the economy might not just continually provide as if it was this automatic thing suddenly became under question. But, despite me and people kind of going, oh, wow, okay, so something's happening here. It actually took a while for anything to happen, to happen kind of politically from below. So
as far as 2008.
I mean, really, it's 2016, which I think is probably the key moment with first Brexit and then the election of Trump, because they happen in the very nerve centers of global capitalism. I mean, obviously in the US, but also the UK, even though it's obviously at the level of the US, in terms of the role of London as a major financial center, the kind of deglobalizing aspect of Brexit, of pulling out of the EU, was a really key moment, and so that's why we kind of, ultimately you've got to like put your cards down and say like, all right, what's the date, right? Because these are processes. It happens kind of iteratively. There's lots of things that go on, but ultimately it's 2016, which marks the end of history.
Did you want to add something, Toussaint?
That sounds so final. The end is over now. Okay. I know that in my readings of history, people get a little loopy around the turn of the century. So Francis Fukuyama makes this pronouncement, writes this book, writes this essay. How did it get to be so widespread, this idea that history was ending? I was a kid and I knew of this idea.
Some
I don't
things
know.
just catch a spark. Yeah, no, it's a good question to which I don't have an answer. It is remarkable. I think everybody who's like a writer, hopes to kind of catch the moment in that way and really be like, right, you've just said exactly what's going on. But I think it did catch a certain mood, right? Obviously people misread him, as I kind of indicated. People misunderstood him as being triumphalist, as saying that there wouldn't be any more events anymore, that everybody would suddenly become a liberal democracy, all that, or that he was specifically defending American capitalism, which he wasn't. He'd probably be more inclined to a certain kind of soft social democracy of kind of continental European style. But so these are all kind of various forms of misreading him. I guess what people saw in that was a certain vindication for what they held, with the views that they already held, their prejudices, that capitalism was the best. And here we go, here's someone saying that not only is it the best, but it's won, right? Like this is a definitive victory. And to a certain extent, it is a definitive victory. I think Fukuyama was right. It's not like I'm saying that, like our book and everything isn't a way of trying to criticize Fukuyama. In fact, it's trying to criticize some of the misreadings, but also to say that he, history never really ends, right? That it's hard to have like any kind of stable fixed formation in modernity, because because capitalism itself is always changing, transforming, fighting its own crises, which emerge from its own contradictions. And so while you might get a sort of stable order in a while, that comes to be undermined, right? And so things do fall apart constantly. So you have these kind of quiet periods, and then suddenly things happen, and often they can be happening. What's, I guess, particular about our moment, exactly that things are falling apart, but there's nothing rising to take its place, right? Certainly not from below, from the masses, and even within the elite, there isn't really a movement within the elite broadly cast, right? There's no movement for anything radically different. For all the talk of kind of right populists, the rise of the far right, they're not proposing actually a particularly different way of organizing society, other than it being more hostile to outsiders, more intolerant, xenophobic, whatever, more nationalist. But this is all kind of frosting on the top of the cake. They're not reordering the cake in any way.
That actually leads me to my next question. You claim in your piece that we were witnessing the fall of the neoliberal order, and you claim it's being replaced by a kind of techno-populism. Could you tell us kind of what that looks like, or what is techno-populism?
Yeah, techno-populism, which sounds like a yet undiscovered genre of music, which someone should maybe Jason, maybe you want to.
That's what I make on the weekends.
Yeah, cool. We should maybe an outro to this show, play some techno-populism. There's actually various versions of like Brazilian kind of music, which then get a techno label attached to it. It's just like a harder pumping version of it. first with populism music.
I'm sure
Anyway.
Vice did a documentary on it.
Right. No, exactly. Yeah. Somewhere in the depths of the Amazon, there's goths playing techno-populism.
Techno-populism is the drug taking over Sao Paulo.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, I'm the biggest dealer here, I think. So, right. So techno-populism. I mean, techno-populism isn't something that's replacing neoliberalism, but rather there are things that happen that work on two different levels. So techno-populism is a political thing, right? Neoliberalism refers also to the management of the economy, and so techno-populism is the fusion of two terms, and it's not my coinage actually. It's Christopher Bickerton and his co-author, whose name Carlo Invernizzi, and their analysis is basically that, contrary to what we often think of politics over the past couple of years, decades even, being a confrontation between populists and technocrats, between a Hillary Clinton and a Donald Trump, to take an obvious example. Actually, politics now is very much a fusion of those two elements, and everyone's really a techno-populist. It's the terrain on which political contestation happens now. And so what does that actually mean? What is a fusion of technocracy on the one hand, ruled by experts, or at least ruled by politicians who use the authority of experts to bolster their own, and populism, which is an appeal to the people at large, who are cast as kind of morally good against an elite, which is seen as illegitimate, right? To put it in the broadest terms. And how they join to that, you have reference still to ideas effectively being correct or incorrect. So rather than political ideas representing a determinate group or interest, right? So like we want higher wages, and this is in the interests of workers and carried through by trade unions and their political representatives in labor parties, right? You just have ideas still treated as either correct or incorrect, and you wheel out your experts to verify that. And the kind of right-wing populists who supposedly experts actually don't have a problem with dependence on experts. They just wheel out their own, right? They're counter experts. They wheel out someone to say, actually, no, vaccines are dangerous and masks don't work. And then the kind of liberal types say, no, you need to be wearing a mask at all times because you need to, and so on. So politics still is kind of fought out on this terrain of competing expertise rather than on political claims about what we want or a future vision of society. But you can't just be like, hey, the eggheads are in charge, right? These experts say this, and so this is what we got to follow, because no one believes that anymore. No one buys that, other than perhaps a slender section of the middle class, university educated, and so on, who are happy to trust people like them.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, no, exactly. But we're happy to trust people like us. Oh, they went to university. Harvard. Oh, that's great. I went to Harvard too. Like, yeah, let's guy in charge. Stop the president like doing what they want to do. Listen to the Harvard guy, right? But because that no longer works to already the population, basing your claims on that, you have to rely on a gesture towards the people, right? That we're all in this together, the people as a kind of undifferentiated mass. So you kind of get both at once. And one of our key things is, Silvio Berlusconi in Italy, who since the early 90s has been effectively a techno-populist well before the term was even coined. He incorporates populist aspects basically by saying, hey, I'm just like you guys, screw the kind of old corrupt elite, we're kind of masses, and my habits are kind of crude just like yours. I'm a womanizer, but hey, you're a womanizer too. This is all great. We don't have any of these uptight kind of Moors or even kind of more civic-minded liberals telling us that this is the way that politics should work and we should have decorum. Like, screw that stuff, right? At the same time as him saying, hey, I'm this businessman. I've been very successful in business. I'm going to take what I've learned and all the dynamism I have for making money and bring that into politics, very technocratic. And so already there was a kind of obvious fusion of it. I'm just going to move out of the way so you can see Berlusconi's face.
I did want to ask you about that. So 2016, we get the rise of Trump here in the States. You get Boris Johnson in UK, but Trump definitely runs on a weird everyman almost ticket, being that he's never been everyman, and he's viewed as a business success, even though he kind of sort of hasn't really been a business success throughout his career. And if it wasn't for COVID, a lot of people feel that he probably would have gotten reelected.
Yeah.
What is then the future of politics in the West? Because it is so centered around personalities, especially if you think for the United States context, Reagan on. It's simply personality. I mean, Reagan literally spills the beans in 1984 in a debate against Walter Mondale that he is part of a large scandal involving foreign nations and arms dealing, to the point where the moderator says, wait, what you're saying is illegal. And in the next debate, he makes a joke and he wins. I believe he won every district.
Every state except Minnesota.
So, we love personalities. Bill Clinton, first black president. George Bush is a guy you can do drugs with and have a beer with. Barack Obama is going to bring hope and change, and he's black. So now I'm not racist. To the point where Joe Biden, who's been a average politician his entire career, is now supposed to be the smart guy in the room. What is the future of politics if we're so obsessed with personality and technocratic solutions?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's, it's kind of the $64 million question, because, and actually you're right in pointing to those US examples, because I think that's kind of where it emerges first. It's the place where TV becomes so crucially important to politics before it does in Europe. And so it migrates to Europe. And so I was just mentioning Berlusconi, and not to go on about him, but he's the guy who kind of is the first to really make use of television as a political technology in Italy. So he's, and people at the time were talking about it as an American politics. But that doesn't really undo the knot. That doesn't really tell us anything other than that it started in the US. But so what? It also reflects a broader breakdown of public and private, right? I think, I'm probably of an age where I just about have a sense of the two, and maybe just because of my political education, I've come to have a defense of the difference between public and private, but younger generations just do not at all, right? Yeah. To the extent that, and I'm sure we'll come on to talk about this, but that your political ideals and identity, what you describe yourself as politically, isn't seen as some necessarily a public commitment, but is something about you and your authentic self. And so if someone tries to and says, hey, you're wrong, it's like a personal offense. So it's not at the level like up here, like let's discuss as adults and debate. It's like a personal attack, a wound to your very soul, because, you deciding to be a kind of, furry Maoist, or what's like Maoist. Do you feel like something very true about you? Yeah, go on.
Let me ask this question to the panel and of us of the chat as well. Do you feel that this has something to do with the commodification of even personal identity? I showed it in a group chat we have. It showed up in how Facebook says, they always say, like, look at all this shit you need to buy, and it is just a bunch of bullshit that I like, sadly. And a pair of Doc Martens showed up that were red and like were they red and black, Toussaint?
They were red and the symbols were yellow.
Yellow, yeah. And it was yellow. It was like red Doc Martens with a yellow hammer and sickle in them. And I'm gonna go out on a limb and say they weren't manufacturing those massively, and this was probably someone made it, but it showed up on some site to buy clothes, and I thought that was funny. But there is something to be said about, I wear these symbols, therefore I am. And, to your point of it's attacking you personally to even have some sort of exchange of ideas. But do you think that does come from the world in which we exist now, you talk about hyper-polarization. Does this get ramped up through the lens of social media?
Yeah. I mean, like, social media is the major conduit to it. I don't want to be like, technologically determinist and say, yeah, if there wasn't social media, this wouldn't happen. Though I do like to speculate idly and dream, even like, oh man, what if social media had emerged in a kind of healthier culture? If social media had emerged in the 1930s or something, or even the 1950s, it would have been a very different thing, and would have been probably a far more productive thing in being able to unite everyone in the same space to be able to debate things, and not in such a narcissistic society as ours. But anyway, that's kind of by the by, and that's not going to happen, sadly. So social media is definitely the conduit through which this kind of breakdown happens. But I did want to kind of come back to your question about, is this the future of politics? And maybe to be a little bit kind of theoretical about this, in this situation of kind of breakdown of public and private, and where like things which used to refer exclusively to the public realm, like a political identity, and are now understood as a very much a private matter, that there's like kind of a direct link between the highest order of politics, right? Who the president is, or what your future vision of society is, directly very much to your intimate self, without any mediation through your membership in your local party or your trade union. And then that mediates through party cadres up to like local elections, and et cetera, et cetera. The way politics effectively used to work, where it was much more hierarchical and organized, but in the best sense of the word, that there was a way to transmit things through actual structures, rather than it just being trying to shout, like as if me, an individual, shouting on social media at the president with nothing in
You're
between
holding
us.
him accountable.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly.
Well,
Yeah.
well, okay.
So let me just finish the thought,
Sorry.
because because of this situation, because we're kind of not used to dealing with people in organizations other than kind of at work, which is a very unfree environment, right? But never of our own volition and in a kind of autonomous way. That isn't a real experience for a lot of people, of being memberships of voluntary organizations. You're not used to dealing with other people. You're not used to kind of other people's authority, in legitimate authority, right? And so there's just a broad scale mistrust in all institutions, civic institutions, public institutions, which everybody knows about, right? You look at any polls, and like in the US, Congress is like the least trusted organization. Journalists, lawyers, the Supreme Court, Congress, I already said Congress, the presidency, teachers, whatever you care to mention. Like the only thing which kind of remains in a lot of countries might be the military, but that depends where you are. In the US, it's still reasonably well trusted. I'm trying to think of what the other one, but this is only kind of like 64%. So it's still only like 2/3 of the population which has trust in the military. So it's not even that large. It's not that intense, basically. In that situation of general mistrust in institutions, it does create a vacuum for politicians who are able to make a connection on a charismatic basis directly with people, to suddenly generate a lot of support, fanatical, perhaps, devotion, and accumulate a lot of power on that basis. And I think that's kind of the danger a little bit right now, that that if we don't trust anyone, you don't trust institutions which might counterbalance power, or try to kind of, effectively have political struggle through organizations against other organizations, that you end up, like having the fanatical Trumpers supporting Trump. But it kind of happens on the left as well. The degree to which everybody put so much faith in Bernie as this guy. And he's just like some old dude who's a Democrat, well, effectively a Democrat, and has been in Congress for ages, as like the guy who's going to resolve everything. And that creates a problematic situation.
There seems to be a fair amount of hero worship. The piece I'm working on that is partially inspired by some of the work that you guys have done in Bunga. is the idea that we're living in a current state of kayfabe, which is an old carnival term where you never break the secret of the magician's trick. You never break pro wrestling. It's a common term used. So you never let people in on the fact that it's all rigged. And and doing the research, and I'm almost finished with the end of it. When you think about news, and I see some people commenting, to me, their comments are part of the kayfabe play out. News is partisan. It wasn't always that way. News was just read. And I mean, it had a slant, right? If you live in the United States, America won a war. if you live elsewhere, I'm sure it's very different. But being that the early news people, news was something that took a loss on TV stations. There's a quote from the 60s where the president of CBS was like telling the news organizations, "I'll spin what you want. I don't care. I have Jack Benny to make money." So we used to have more documentaries that really showed what America looked like, and all that stuff ends in the late 60s and 70s as there's more news consolidation and the rise of shows like 60 Minutes, which connects people on a personal level to quote unquote news stories that may not be news of the day and may not even be political, maybe more drama and celebrity based. But what I see happening is as the cable news networks came to power and news becomes more partisan, and that same financial strategy of news being financially successful because it connects emotionally, it doubles down on the partisan nature of how you view news. So instead of even having quote unquote news people like Ted Koppel or Dan Rather, you have generic pundits. They don't have to know much about the story. All they have to do is say, that liberal Joe Biden did X. This fascist Donald Trump did Y. And that then becomes the dialogue even in these independent spheres. We all kind of play along. But still, it doesn't really highlight the fact that there is a failure in institutions, which is a bipartisan failure. Right? And this is kind of across the board, even where you live in Brazil. Bolsonaro doesn't come out of nowhere. Did you want to add to that?
Yeah, well, I think there's a deep level of cynicism, right? And this is the kind of like Slavoj Žižek's notion of cynicism. Actually takes it from Peter Sloterdijk, who I reference in the piece. But anyway, not to throw names around. The point is that the cynical approach is not so much that you're completely kind of disbelieving and negative. It's just that you have a kind of, there's always a distance between you and the thing, whether it's like the news, for example, the news reader. And so no one really believes, right? No one like, so you might be a Fox News viewer or you might be an MSNBC viewer. But you probably think actually the other guy is a dupe, because, if you're a Fox News viewer, the MSNBC viewer is the guy who like totally believes their lies and he's totally bought in, right? Mm-hmm. And vice versa. Whereas actually probably no one's really bought in because of what I was just saying before, that no one really trusts, no one really trusts any institutions, right? So mm-hmm. It's not this full scale buy-in. What there is a kind of always a slight kind of ironic distance. You might like Tucker Carlson because he explains things in a nice way and you think broadly he's a writer, might be a nice guy. But I mean, I don't know what the level of buy-in to every single word that he says, right? There's always this distance. And yet, so we don't really believe in any of the kind of big narratives that were sold. And yet we carry on participating in them, right? So in our actions, we still act as if we do believe, even if we don't believe. And that kind of insulates us from the consequences of continuing to act. So you might go and vote, Republican, you might vote Donald Trump because and this is a person who is also listening to Tucker Carlson or whatever. But there's always a kind of a little bit of a distance from the actual thing. So you participate, but in your mind, you're saying, yeah, but I'm not a dupe because I don't really deeply believe in this. It's just that like there's not really any alternative, and I want to say, stick 2 fingers up to, or 1 finger up, as this is, kind of American context,
How do you,
1 middle finger up to the powers that be. But I don't really deeply believe, and so we're all kind of insulated from really taking any political responsibility, because there's always that kind of like, yeah, but I'm doing it, but even it.
but how do you deal with the situation when the actual technocrats themselves demonstrate an incapacity to govern over a strategic crisis issue, for example, something like COVID, and demonstrate such absolute bankruptcy at being this transparently honest with the public upon things from masks to vaccines and the total just botching is so clear. How do we avoid something like that breeding the cynicism that causes people to lose faith in any institution at all?
Yeah. I mean, it's really hard to know, but I think the whole COVID thing, I think, probably made a lot of people, even if they were followers of more or less the mainstream indications and guidelines and so on, and broadly trusted, Fauci in the US or whoever it might be, did probably undermine a lot of trust even further because of their constantly shifting guidelines, and the fact that at a deeper level the state was completely unprepared to deal with a pandemic and responded in ways which were often very authoritarian, with lockdowns, depending on which state you were in the US, but certainly across Europe, with lockdowns which were just kind of pathetic compensation for the fact that they weren't actually prepared for how to deal with the pandemic, and they just went, oh crap, well, let's just lock everything down, which is pretty crazy and very problematic in terms of civil liberties and so on. But I think the way that people don't, or can, like, another way that people avoid reckoning with that, right? And especially if you're on the kind of, maybe in the US, like kind of on the liberal side, right? So you're like, oh, I'm with Fauci or whatever, is precisely to kind of double down on your allegiance to your camp, because it kind of insulates you from having to deal with the contradictions that are very obviously there, right? So that they said, you should never wear a mask. Like, that's not a good idea. Oh no, you should always wear a mask. No, but it has to be this mask. Actually, maybe masks don't matter. And you go, no, Fauci's always right. And it's like, well, like this is how probably, Americans in the Cold War laughed at people in the Soviet Union, and thought, they're all dupes. They say one thing and people go along with it the whole time. What a bunch of dupes. No, it's kind of a cynical way of responding to something which is completely contradictory. But because you don't maybe trust yourself, you don't trust your fellow citizens to actually try to make any claims about how to resolve it. And also you're scared of the other side, of feeding into the other side, right? So it's like, well, yeah, it's kind of ridiculous that they told us not to wear masks and then told us to wear masks, and like they are not even sure about what the science is behind it, and they're saying that these things is completely absolute and we're not sure, blah blah blah. But if I start making that claim out loud, I'm going to sound like one of them, right? I'm going to sound like one of those.
My daughter did that to me when the whole pandemic was first starting. I was with my kid and we were getting food somewhere, and I just walked out of the car, forgot my mask. My daughter goes, "Dad, go get your mask. You're gonna look like a Trumper."
Wow.
Yeah.
But Toussaint, did you want to add something before we move on?
Well, I'll say this. Sometimes I see a cute guy walking down the street and I'm like, wait a minute. You can't be that cute because you're not wearing a mask. I shouldn't know that you're cute. You being cute should be a secret.
I want to ask this question and move us into cancellation territory in certain realms of the internet.
Okay.
Great for the algorithm there.
Eat a bowl of fuck.
With a feeling of a loss of faith in institutions, and with the feeling of powerlessness against, especially in the States, two-party system, right? Does that create kind of this new rejuvenated love affair with identity politics? Like it's the only terrain in which a young left, especially in the States, I can't speak for the UK, and I definitely won't speak for Brazil. I think it's a little more established there. But does this identity terrain become the new terrain that people want to fight on, opposed to a true political one, and build real heterogeneous movements? And I'll take my answer off air.
I think it's safer. I think it's safer. There are people who want to argue. I was talking to a friend who's very into comic books. He and I were sitting across from each other, but he had to take a call, and he took the call to argue about comic books with some other guy. And when he hung up, I was like, how can you get so passionate about something so inconsequential? And he's like, that's exactly why I can put so much passion into it. There's no stakes. So for some people, I think that's the case. It's so much easier to argue when there's no stakes for some people. And yeah.
I think that there's an aspect of the identity politics argument that is so normally adhered to by citizens. It's an easier pitch. It's an easier pitch because people, when you say my identity, my blackness, my womanhood, my sexual orientation, there's a certain base element that you're appealing to that someone can say, oh, I can see that. I can identify with that. When you say someone's economic position, your class, your status, it makes them think a little bit more in terms of how they are relating to the political economy they live in. And sometimes they don't want to make that extra analysis because it's easier and it's more supportive to maintain with the identity that's easier for them to acknowledge, which is their phenotypical one or their gendered one.
Yeah. Yeah, I think what you said there, Pascal, is very, very true. And it's conservative, deeply conservative. Identity politics has always came from the right. It ended up on the left as of the kind of 1960s. But we shouldn't blind ourselves to the fact that it is always inherently something of the right, because it asks the question, who am I? Right, at fundamentally, rather than where do we want to be going, which maybe sounds a little bit kind of lightweight as a way to put it, but I think it's fundamental in the sense that the left is defined by its future orientation, whereas the right is always defined by its defense of the status quo, or even desire to return to the past. And so who are you, who am I, can only refer to the past, because it's what defines you being black. Well, it's who your parents are or whatever, or in whatever case it is, it looks to the past. Maybe with some of the kind of sexual and gender identities, it has less of that element, but it's still entirely inwardly directed. So I don't, and ultimately, as we know, for all that identity politics defenders and practitioners say that we're trying to build links between the oppressed or the excluded or the whatever, it's completely untrue. That it is mutually hostile and extremely corrosive and breaks everyone apart from one another. So there is no capacity for solidarity. So I don't think we should be by this stage, no one, I think, is under any illusion about what identity politics is. You just have to take your side. And anybody who takes a side of identity politics, I think, is just simply not, has no capacity for proposing any sort of progressive or indeed radical politics. But I think the thing about well, actually, I'm going to kind of return back to what Pascal was saying, that in how kind of identity politics provides, or actually rather Jason's question about whether identity politics provides an opening. And I think the putting it in terms of consequences about stakes is the right one. That's a good way to evaluate politics. And I kind of always joke, but I think I'm serious about this. Like, if it feels good, don't do it. Right? Politics is about discipline. and very little else other than discipline, self-discipline and collective discipline. And if it feels good because you're getting a frisson of je ne sais quoi, of from provoking your enemies, because you're on the left and you love provoking the right, or maybe your proximate enemy of a rival left faction or whatever, and that feels good, and and you feel like you're being rebellious or whatever it might be, that's probably not a good indication of, or rather, that's probably a good indication that has no consequences, that it's not very serious. If it's hard and difficult and doesn't really provide you much satisfaction, much jouissance, then you're probably that's probably more serious politics, right? And the reason for that is that politics which provides you with that frisson is something which fills a hole within you, right? And if you're filling a hole within you by, for example, being obsessed with the far right and saying, "Oh, the far right is really bad," you're not examining yourself, you're not just yourself as an individual, but your collective politics of your group or your organization. So you're not trying to improve and better deal with the challenges that face you, and instead kind of outsourcing all those problems onto the right, in this specific example. So if it feels good, don't do it. And identity politics is all about feeling good.
What does this mean for memes? Because memes feel good.
I thought you were saying, what does this mean for me?
Oh, so now we got to bring Watson in here. We got to bring Watson in here to yell at us about memes.
Memes are great. They feel wonderful, but I guess you're right. It's not politics.
I agree. I like memes too, and I think they can serve some form of propaganda, and I think that's important. And sometimes propaganda might feel good as well. That's part of politics, right? But yeah, I guess if you're putting the cart before the horse, then that's a problem, right?
Yeah, it can't all be propaganda. Pascal, you look like you want to say something.
Well, the thing is, though, so much of politics in the West is rooted in emotionality. When you say if it feels good, don't do it, regardless of what faction, whether it's the right or the left, so much of it is based on emotional reaction to stimuli. It seems almost counterfactual to say if it feels good, don't do it, because it then becomes how are we going to get people to come out for your rally if they don't get that buzz for that high? How are you going to get people to sign up to stay up all night to put up those those placards if they don't feel that connection? There is a certain emotional kind of opiate-like nature to politics that I question sometimes of whether or not we can escape, because how else do we explain why we keep getting people attached to these personalities in the United States and in the West?
Well, can I ask this question to you guys then? So, Alex says if it feels good, don't do it, with his tongue somewhat planted in his cheek. Pascal brings up a good point that we do need to feel good about, what we're doing. What then happens when it's only feeling good? So, for example, I shut down the freeway. We tore up a Walmart. And then what? That's it. I busted my nut. I busted my nut shutting down the freeway. I busted my nut throwing a can of soup.
Those are good lyrics, by the way.
Oh, dude, let's be honest about it. Let's not beat around the bush and use some sort of fancy word. I bust my nut doing this kind of trivial stuff to fuck shit up. Then what? And this is now politics, right? I punched a fascist, or someone I said was a fascist is just some douchebag dude that has a Trump shirt. But I punched him. I busted my nut. That's politics. What happens then? And I'm just asking the question. I don't know the answer. What happens then when that then becomes politics? Because to me, that plays into the whole idea of kayfabe.
That is the question, right? I think that's like the question which we should always be asking. Everybody should be asking. And then what, right? Like account for yourself, account for your own politics. Sometimes you don't know. Like sometimes I think it is legitimate to say, listen, we don't know what the kind of full consequences of this will be, how it'll play out, but it will provide a political opening for future action, right? And that's okay, right? That is, you can't just completely plan out the sequence of action and reaction and consequences of the whole way until you reach the promised land. Like, that's not what I'm, suggesting. But at least you have to be self-conscious about the fact that you don't know exactly what the consequences are. But I think in many of the cases, like you busted nut stopping the freeway, like there literally there hasn't been that question, right? So it's not a question like we don't know, but the stopping of traffic may then provoke people. I think it probably doesn't reach further than, oh, it'll make people think about driving their cars. It's like, okay, well, put yourself in their shoes. Like, are they going to be sympathetic to your cause, or are they going to be like really fucking annoyed that that they've had their day disrupted by these people who clearly don't have anything on that day and have enough free time to be able to disrupt a freeway? Like, I think it's pretty clear. So, but yeah, the way you put it, the question's right. And then what?
Well, I think.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
No, you go ahead, son.
Okay, I think there's a difference between strategy and tactics. I think that's something that people need to be educated about. I think some of the tactics might feel good, laying down in the street, stopping some guy from going to a job interview. That's just something to collateral damage. You didn't think about that, but it feels good laying down in the street and stopping people. But is that part of a strategy? What is the overall goal? And are you, maybe you do really like dressing up like you're in The Handmaid's Tale, but what did you accomplish? And I don't think enough people are asking what they accomplished, or they're not asking enough of what they put their work into.
Do you guys think that sometimes we're a bit naive, because we do live in a world where fame is instantaneous now through, and I'm not trying to say social media is the most horrible thing in the world. As I exist in social media, I fuck with Alex on Twitter all the time and my friend Dan Larson. So I love a lot of aspects of social media, but I'm not blind to the fact, as someone that was in show business for the majority of his adult life, that there's kind of an instant success factor that people get addicted to. Remember the naked protester in Portland? There seems to be like, if I do it on camera, this is a movement that I want to be part of, but nothing really gets accomplished. In Alex's piece, he points out that, you would go to the meeting headquarters to discuss strategy. Now you just, drop your location and everyone meets up and then they scream in unison and then we depart. How do we separate the wheat from the chaff when it comes to even attempting to build out a movement, when we have kind of the specter of instantaneous fame behind us? Because there is an influencer culture that is penetrating even independent media.
I think that was something that couples that problem is when you have the movements themselves are instantaneous hashtag phenomenon that breed a certain lack of accountability, like we've seen in some of the recent phenomena we've learned about Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black Lives that lead to really horrible consequences. And I think that part of the problem is that we need to stop believing that digital is always the answer or a replacement for human contact. I think that there's something to be said for the old school organizing around educating and meeting people in physical spaces and dealing where they are, instead of surrendering to the digital all the time. And I think that's something that will breed a level of accountability that we might be lacking in this contemporary moment, where everyone's kind of like a click or a button away from each other.
Yeah, and I think like a good example, to not just be negative about this, like I hear sometimes, right, about whether it's a landless workers movement in Brazil or the like homeless workers movement, which is a kind of poor translation, but it's workers without roofs movement, which is kind of an urban movement. Of them, they occupy some land, some territory, and to force the government to build houses there, and it's often terrain that's kind of been left fallow, not used, and someone's just been squatting on it for ages. And there's even a thing in the Brazilian constitution about the need to product land, right? And so they do that, and then sometimes the police will come to chuck them out, and repulse the police, and actually defend the territory or whatever, right? I'll hear about it, but it's like, damn, this isn't all news. This isn't all over, like a major thing. And but why, right? Like, step back for a second. Your instinct, my instinct, that there was like, man, this should have been streamed all over social media. This should have been a whole, internet event. And actually, like, no, hang on. They have a specific thing to achieve there, which is specifically in relation to housing, specifically in relation to those people who don't have somewhere to live, and to try to force the government to take action. So that's their kind of proximate objective. You might have from that to have a bit of a propaganda coup by taking what happened and putting that out in the world, right? Cool, that's fine. That's like actually very old politics, right? What's different about a lot of the kind of politics today, which is mediatized before it is even thought out, right? It's kind of fully subsumed by media. The media takes precedence over the actual action itself, is precisely that in many of these cases, like, let's just get everyone together and then live stream what we're doing. But there's like nothing beyond that exactly. It is just propaganda without, like, actually, instead of being the propaganda of the deed in the sense of like the kind of old anarchist idea, it's the deed of the propaganda. I'm just thinking this out loud. I don't know if that makes sense, but I'm going to think
What would
about
Bernays say?
Well, exactly. But it's the deed of the propaganda. You're just doing that. You're like your whole action, everything that you're doing is just propaganda. In aim of
Propaganda.
what? Right, exactly.
In the name of propaganda.
Even more propaganda. So, I think it's kind of sometimes a good indication if you see someone doing politics in some way, and the media isn't the first, it doesn't come first, but it's a secondary thing of communicating to a wider public your gains, your wins, your what exactly has happened. Then that's probably a you can go about tick, right? Like that's a healthier, more productive approach to politics.
Pascal.
I think that's a very good point, and I think that M2 Sot made a very good point when she talked about tactics versus strategy. That's a very, very salient point, knowing the difference between the one or the other, and knowing that we're trying to actually develop a strategy for the long haul. And I think that part of the problem also is that the desire for the gratification in the immediate, we expect that these things should be taken care of in a year. It took 10 years from Selma, from Memphis to Selma, to get the civil rights. I mean, these things took decades. The 20s and 30s, it took a while before the labor movements in the United States were going around since the late 19th century, before we started to get the reforms that we really needed in this country. And some of us really are so stuck in the desire for the immediate, we fail to realize that sometimes it's going to take a lot more dedication than this news cycle or what's hot.
But the midterms are coming up, and PragerU just put out this video, and we need to respond to it.
Well, what then happens though? Again, this is kind of my point. What then happens when you live in a moment where the punditry and the news, inverted quotes, of the day is constantly asking for overnight fixes? So student debt is a relatively newer phenomenon, especially in cities or states that had public universities for the United States context, right? From the late 60s on, and now it's astronomical, the debt that young people are getting themselves into to just be a barista. And there's been movements, relatively new movements, to try to mitigate some of this damage, especially with the for-profit colleges, which is also a newer phenomenon. I mean, that happened with Obama, that those things got ramped up and got all this government money for student loans, right? And so the debt collective we've had on the show a couple times. Before Biden, I think we had him on the show, right, Pascal?
Yes, we did.
They got some loan forgiveness for Corinthians College, which was one of those for-profit colleges that said, we're going to give you job placement, and they give you a Craigslist listing of jobs. And then I think we got there was another for-profit school. It was either DeVry, I can't remember the name of it, that there was some student loan forgiveness for, and then there was this $10,000 thing that came down, which definitely doesn't solve it. But it's a conversation that's a relatively new conversation that we're having in the political context in the West, in America. And automatically there's the punditry that's like, not enough. You said you were going to eliminate it all. You didn't do it all. Let's get you out and get a new person in that will make these same empty promises, but they're going to deliver. It's almost like it's a perpetual cycle that people are stuck in. And again, you keep playing the game. It's almost like rooting for it. It feels to me like we're rooting for sports teams. And that seems like a dead end.
A lot of this politics is like rooting for sports teams. Sadly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the kind of short-termism has become increasingly short-termist. It's kind of probably something that's always inherent within capitalism, but especially with financialization, it's made everything, it's shortened the time span for absolutely everything. And that like is at root of the political short-termism, the political that politics and state action is only there to adapt to what the markets are doing rather than try to shape them, to dominate markets or even demarketify, decommodify certain areas, as a way of shaping how society should be run, or how you believe society should go. And as a consequence, the only pole which could have any notion of being long-termist is the left. So if we're being long-termist, anyway, I think because people say short-termist, but no one says long-termist. But if we're not the ones thinking the long term and insisting that we think that way, and that kind of governs how not that you don't sometimes need to take some immediate action, right? But if ultimately your politics isn't determined by the long term, then no one else's is, and society continues to accelerate because ultimately what's determining things is the pace at which the market works at, and then that determines politics and everything else. So if we're not holding ourselves to account to be long-termist, then we're fucked. I mean, then no one else is.
Well,
someone's saying that if it takes another 50 years, then we can just forget about it. Well, I'm not saying it's going to take another 50 years. They're saying that we don't have a movement, that we just have a pacification program. Well, what I'm saying is that who's assuming we have a movement right now? Why are we assuming we have a movement today?
Yeah, and things can change very rapidly, right? Like, I think that's something, sometimes there can be a kind of turning point where history accelerates and where your little clique or organization which you're putting together, your 10 folks kind of together suddenly explodes because the moment changes and things can happen rather rapidly. So it's not like you're saying to people, oh, we need a 50-year plan, and it's like, oh man, we got to do 50 years, but like, I'm 40 now, that means I'm going to be 90. I'm I'm going to do something else with my time, actually, right? It's not that. It's more just that you have to think in the long term, and then if history accelerates, actually then you're better prepared because you're thinking kind of longer term spans of 10 years, 20 years, not the next 4 years or the next 2 years or indeed the next 3 months.
Tucson,
the only political discourse that is consistent in America right now, outside of the reactionaries, is the reactionaries are coming, stop the fascists. That's all politics is right now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's like the politics of the core of the state, right? It's not just like something that the left is doing or the kind of the Democrats are doing. It's like state. This is the kind of the dark Brandon semi-fascist speech.
Yes.
Like it's there's no joking matter anymore. Like, and I have been saying this for a while, but now it's like, no, now it's real. Now no one can contest this. That like anti-fascism actually is state policy, right? And it is a bolster to the current order. So, I like, it was a provocative quote, right? You guys have probably heard this before, but Amadeo Bordiga, kind of Italian left communist, said that the worst product of fascism was anti-fascism. Not because of the way that it warped left politics and warped revolutionary politics, to the extent that it took people off track of pursuing revolutionary transformation, and made them, mainstream forces to defeat fascism. And it's a blackmail that's used. It's a blackmail that's used against the left. Instead of staying your course and focusing on what your goals are, which are not particular goals, but universal goals for ultimately, if we're honest with ourselves, for human emancipation, then you've got to stick on that track and not get distracted by that voice in your ear going, but the fascists, but the fascists. Not least because today does not provide the conditions for fascism, because fascism is ultimately about crushing the working class and crushing socialism. And if there's no socialism, there's no job for fascism to do. So I think it's just a lot of noise. I think there is a rise of a far right, of a new form of new right, which does present a sort of challenge, but they're not the ones even in power. So that's not even the primary concern.
Don't tell anyone we're socialists. They might crush us. There's a couple of us.
Pascal, you want to say anything before we go?
No, man, I really appreciate this conversation. I didn't know we were going to get that deep into it. I mean, I knew we were, because Alex is always, the end of history is always a cerebral kind of deep dive subject matter. But Alex, I would love to have you come back on and talk more about your political prognostications as well as your current writings.
No, I'd love to. And I mean, I can always, take it down a notch and just make some dick jokes or something.
You always have to be prepared for dick jokes on this show, and just weird segues. But thank you so much.
Yeah.
Again, Alex. I feel like I say your name wrong.
I'm not fussy, so it's fine. However you like, Alex.
Because there's a referee, an NFL referee that's super buff, Ed Hochuli.
I've learned this, and obviously I'm revealing that I've Googled myself before, but yeah,
he came up.
he comes up,
and his son, I believe, is a referee as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, he's my uncle. So we.
Are you being serious?
No.
Oh,
nice. That was good. I believe.
I was going to be excited about that.
Kayfabe, baby.
Kayfabe. And on that note, here it comes. I saw a clip that I'm working with someone for this video essay for the first time, and he showed me a clip of like the first 2 parts of it. There's so much wrestling in it, because I do use the wrestling parallel, and I'm so excited for it. I'm so excited for you guys to see it.
Nice.
Also, I'm excited for you guys to get Pascal's smiling face on a t-shirt. What's stopping you from getting a mug? I had one, mine broke. Look at that. You can get Pascal smiling at you on a mouse pad with a Bill Cosby grin. Who doesn't want that? Who doesn't want a Bill Cosby grin on their thing? And to Alex is saying techno-populism needs to be a genre of music. Oh, it's just a button click away.
Oh, yeah.
You thought I didn't make it. Oh, I did. Who doesn't have an Anglo-pessimism shirt to confuse all of their normie friends?
Oh, man,
These
I
are
want
things you
that.
need, guys. Look at this. Malcolm X quote. Oh! All right, that's enough. That's enough capitalism for one day.
Can I just say, I appreciate Alex. I appreciate you for saying memes are okay and we can still have them.
I feel like I've set myself up as some sort of super ego here. Says like, what's okay and what's not okay. No, I mean,
Thank you guys all for joining us. The chat's been great. M. Toussaint has been slipping on her putting you guys' comments on the screen. See, I have stepped away from that role. And that is now M. Toussaint's role. And
But
she was so into the conversation.
Yes.
That's exactly why I know it.
I thought that's what you wanted. You want to be like in the game. Stop messing around in the chat.
Look, you have to walk and chew bubblegum at the same time here on TIR.
Do you know how difficult that is?
Apparently for you, it's very difficult.
Yes.
You know it's not difficult? Making dope music. What? Thank you guys very much for joining us. Tuesday, we're going to have another great show. We're going to be talking Marx and critical race theory. Is Pascal excited for that one? Oh, you bet he is.
I'm looking forward.
If you guys haven't done it, please go listen to the Bunga Bunga cast. Stefan is on there. Jean Bajlan, I believe, has been a guest on there. Hasn't he?
he
You haven't had Gene on?
He should be.
Kurdish erasure. That's what that is. Kurdish erasure.
Yeah, we need to do some Kurdish. Go back to doing some Kurdish politics. We've done it before, but yeah.
Well, thank you, Alex. Everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. We are out.
Out.